this video I'm going to be looking at Leveson, the aftermath of Leveson, and I'm going to be examining the reality behind the hype that Cameron is a defender of freedom of the press. Have you ever wondered why all the paedophiles in the UK appear to be dead? There are obviously one or two exceptions, such as Gary Glitter, people who don't matter very much, but certainly as far as politicians go and members of the police force, all the paedophiles are dead. Well, I can actually answer that in 2 words, and the 2 words are libel law. The reason that all the paedophiles are dead is because libel law does not apply to people who are dead, so accusations can be made against them much more easily. And it's because of the libel law that paedophiles are in this country protected as they are in no other country. It is practically impossible, if you're a defendant in a libel case, to win it. It's very, very difficult anyway, because the burden of proof, as I've explained before, falls on the defendant to prove that what they have said is true. So to prove paedophilia, for example, you would really need to have photographs, I think. It would be extremely difficult to prove it, and therefore the paedophile, because of the libel law, is likely to win the case, and you would have to pay damages. Now, during the Leveson inquiry, the press has very prominently shown us some of the victims of their very poor behaviour. We've seen the McCanns, for example, who I have no doubt suffered really incredibly at a time when they had lost their little daughter. It really was completely inexcusable. And also we remember the hacking of the Milliband phone. That again was inexcusable. I think J.K. Rowling has had a story to tell about how alarmed she was to find that somebody had been in her 5-year-old daughter's school bag. All of that is stuff that people will remember. But in my opinion, it is because of the libel law that these people had to put up with what they had to put up with. I think that, for example, the sensationalist side of the newspapers has been encouraged because they really can't print very much else. They are so controlled now by government that they don't, certainly during the summer, they don't have very much that they can print. And I remember that the McCann story broke, I think it was in May, if I remember correctly, and over the summer they pounded away at it practically every day because actually they didn't have very much else in the news. They can't highlight the misdoings of politicians or people we should be interested in, so they have tended to make the newspapers into gossip magazines, a bit like the old Titbits, which was a gossip magazine that existed in the past. And I think the reason for that, as I say, is because we don't really have freedom of the press. So ironically, it's because of the lack of freedom that these people suffered in the way they did. And also, I think there is the problem that the newspaper, the journalists, believed that people like the McCanns would be too preoccupied with trying to find their daughter to sue for libel and wouldn't have the money to do so because, as I've said before, libel law is only for the rich and famous and influential. It isn't for ordinary people. Most ordinary people cannot afford the legal fees for a libel case. So what was the point of the Leveson inquiry? Well, ostensibly, the spin at least, is that Leveson was examining the question of how this sort of misbehaviour on the part of the press could be prevented. And he was looking into the possibility of including changes in the law which would prevent the suffering that these people endured. My own opinion on this is that this is all about the humanity of the individual journalists concerned. They probably had targets, and the targets would have resulted in them perhaps behaving in a way that normally they might not have behaved in, if they felt pressure on them to get a story, a sensationalist story for the newspaper, for example. But my own opinion, as I say, is that you cannot put empathy into legislation. Empathy is something which journalists either have or they don't have. Obviously, they didn't have it in this occasion. Now, all the headlines since Leveson have been very favourable for Mr. Cameron. They have all suggested that he's the champion of freedom of the press, that he believes in freedom of the press, and that instead of allowing what Leveson recommended, which is that there should be legislation introduced to combat this sort of thing going on in the press, Cameron has instead decided that he will put in place something which is not a part of the legal framework. And we're supposed to believe that this is far better. Well, I'm going to suggest in this video that it's actually far worse. So why is it far worse? Well, at the moment we have the libel laws, and you can't get much worse than that in terms of restrictions. If they introduced new law, that would certainly restrict freedom of speech further. But what Cameron has done is to give a spin to changes which will affect journalists quite dramatically. But it's not as transparent as if he had introduced new legislation. You won't be able to see what is happening. But when I finish this video, I hope by the time I've finished this video you'll understand. If we think about a predatory paedophile like Cyril Smith, who as we know is dead, if we imagine that he was still alive, and we think about the fact that Cameron has now introduced changes which will affect the press, what we can do is ask ourselves the question, could a vigilant and effective press, given the new changes, could they have exposed him? The Daily Mail has very kindly done a summary of what Mr. Cameron recommends. So I'm going to take the first point. It says he's going to introduce an independent regulatory body backed by the law with power to fine the press up to £1 million or 1% of turnover for breaches of a new code of conduct. Well, there are a number of points here. First, independent regulatory body. Even if it started off being independent, why would it continue to be independent? Surely eventually the government would have influence, and so members of the government would not be exposed as paedophiles if they were paedophiles. It says, and this is really very, very important, that the independent regulatory body would have the power to fine the press up to £1 million or 1% of turnover. That is a fantastic sum of money, far more than any libel case would yield. I think the McCanns, who suffered to a huge degree, earned about £500,000 from the libel case, so £1 million is a huge change. And that would be a deterrent to the press. The press would be afraid of taking any risks at all. And in order to expose predatory paedophiles, the press has to take some risk. And they will pay this sanction of £1 million for breaches of a new code of conduct. But we're not told exactly what that new code of conduct will be. The second point is incredibly cynical. There will be a kite mark system for, quote, trusted journalists. That will be a little bit like, something which all journalists have to aspire to. They will want to have that on their CV. So they will all have to be really good prostitutes. They will have to do what the government tells them to do. Otherwise, they will not get a job. And this is going to be a very, very powerful system for controlling the press. I hope most people can see that this is the case. Arbitration for alleged victims to seek redress. Well, nothing wrong with that. And there are going to be harsher penalties, that's more than £1 million presumably, if the press do not recognise the new regulator. So it's hardly voluntary. They're putting a gun up against their head and saying, sign here. The next point is a whistleblowing hotline for journalists who feel under pressure to act unethically. At first sight, that seems reasonable, doesn't it? But if you think about it, whenever a journalist is dealing with something sensitive, he or she is going to feel under pressure to ring the hotline. And of course, if a journalist ever gets into any trouble for what he or she has printed, the question is going to always be asked, did you ring the hotline? So any journalist is going to feel that they cannot print anything controversial at all without ringing the hotline. What is the hotline going to reply? Well, the hotline is there. The whole ethos of the hotline is to protect whoever it is that is about to be exposed. So the hotline is always going to advise not to print. The regulator is to accept complaints from minorities who feel unfairly portrayed. The point at issue here is the word minority. This is not a legal word, it's a term of art, and it can mean absolutely anything. Anybody can portray themselves as a minority. As an example, both sides of the House, both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, bleat on continuously about being unfairly portrayed by the press. So this is quite a dangerous point to introduce because it allows any powerful interest group to effectively hijack the process. And finally, Ofcom is to review how the new watchdog is working and take over if they think it isn't. So this is obviously a case of all roads lead back to the government. So how will these changes, which Joseph Cameron has just introduced, how will they benefit people like the McCanns and the Dowlers? I would suggest, if I'm right about what I say, that it won't benefit them at all, because I'm quite sure that these people would prefer not to have lost their daughters to predatory paedophiles in the first place. And with these new provisions in place, I feel certain that predatory paedophiles will sleep far more soundly in their beds at night, knowing that they are unlikely to be outed by a free press.